Will China ever have its own Barack Obama? This question may seem fanciful, but it's important in its implications. Who is the largest country in the world for? Is it for people who are of Chinese descent? Or is it for anyone in the world who wants to come to China, live in China, be a part of China? Will China ever have its own Barack Obama? Of course I can't answer this question. I can't see the future. But at least I hope to be able to get you to think about this question in a new way. There are two different types of belonging to a country. It can be based on civic identity, or it can be based on ethnic identity. Countries like the United States, Brazil, Canada are based on civic identity. And this kind of identity, belonging to a country, is a little bit like belonging to a club that you choose to join. Your race doesn't matter. Of course, there's racism in these countries. We all know this. But still, as the organizational principles of these countries, race is beside the point. If a person of Chinese descent lives in Canada, for example, and they follow the proper procedures, they can become Canadian. No one's going to say, you know, you're Chinese. You can't become Canadian. You have to be white to become Canadian. Now, in an age of Donald Trump, anybody can say anything. But nonetheless, as the founding principles of these countries, which continue, race doesn't matter. Japan, Korea, and China, on the other hand, have been based on ethnic identity. This is like belonging not to a club, but to a family. It's often thought of as a matter of blood. Your ethnic identity determines your membership. I know Japan well. I speak Japanese. I fit in the society in some sense. But can I become Japanese? No. Legally, I could become Japanese, but if I told my Japanese friends, hey, I'm Japanese, they would laugh at me. They'd say, are you insane? You can't be Japanese. Now, you in the audience can become Canadian if you want to, and if you jump through the hoops to make it possible. But I cannot become Japanese, regardless of how much I may want to, because of my ethnicity. I'm of the wrong ethnicity. This is not a legal matter. I have African friends who are married to Japanese who have Japanese citizenship. So we're not saying they can't become Japanese citizens. This is a social matter. No one in Japan will accept them as being Japanese, just as no one would accept me as being Japanese. Now, of course, all countries are mixtures of civic and ethnic identity. But some countries, like Brazil and Canada, emphasize more civic identity. Others, such as those in Western Europe, are in the middle. And countries like Korea, Japan, and China are based largely on ethnic identity. Now, an important point I need to make here. Civic identity is not necessarily better than ethnic identity. That's not what's being said here. Civic identity is good because it's inclusive, but ethnic identity is good because it's deep, like belonging to a family, as opposed to simply a club. One could say that ethnic identity is racist. Not a racism against any particular ethnic group, but against all ethnic groups other than one's own. But still, in Japan, in Korea, in China, ethnic identity as the organizational basis for society has worked very well for centuries, for millennia. It's been quite successful, obviously. But no more. Ethnic identity is giving way to civic identity all over the world. Why? Well, because people of different ethnicities intermingle, and they wind up falling in love and getting married and having children. This is inevitable. Ethnic identity is giving way to civic identity around the world. And in these three societies I've mentioned, you can see this. Korea has long been highly ethnically based, but today, 13% of marriages in Korea are international. Mostly rural Korean men marrying women from China and the Philippines. International marriages in Japan peaked in 2006 at about 6%. They've gone down since because of tighter immigration laws, but every Japanese city has far more resident foreigners today than it had 30 and 40 years ago, and international marriages inevitably follow. What of China? China has been historically less ethnically based than Japan and Korea. And in China now, as you all know, there are Han Chinese plus 55 minority nationalities. But ethnic consciousness remains quite strong. The most common international marriage is between PRC Chinese and overseas Chinese. Many young Chinese go to study outside China, marry a foreigner, and do not return. But inside China, international marriages remain considerably rarer than in Korea or in Japan. However, as China continues to become richer, more and more people from around the world come to China, not just people who are ethnically Chinese. I wrote a book last year called The World in Guangzhou about the range of foreigners coming to Guangzhou and how they are seeking their fortunes, but also to make better lives for themselves. If China's affluence continues to grow, so too will its internationalization, and so too will its international marriages. Consider Africans in Guangzhou. There are some 15,000 sub-Saharan Africans in Guangzhou, although the number varies depending on the time of year. Many of these Africans stay only briefly, but some stay for years or a decade or more, making Guangzhou their home. There are apparently many hundreds of babies of African Chinese couples. The exact number is impossible to know. One of them may be the future Barack Obama in China. Many of the men in these relationships are overstayers, living in China illegally. Most Africans in Guangzhou leave after a few weeks or months when their visas expire, but a few remain because their business dealings cause them to not be able to leave and stay in China. When they stay in China, they meet Chinese. They fall in love with Chinese. Marriages result, children result. I have been to a number of marriages in churches in Guangzhou between an African husband and a Chinese wife, remarkably joyous affairs, but the husband is an overstayer. These will never be legally recognized. The husband can be arrested, imprisoned, and deported by Chinese authorities at any time. What of their children? There is no dual citizenship in China, so children must either belong to the African country of the father or stay in China for now and perhaps for their entire lives. But what will happen to them? Will they ever be accepted as Chinese? I think of the Chinese African singer Lo Jing, who in 2009 won a singing competition in Shanghai and then was really vilified, grossly criticized online by Chinese netizens for her ethnic mix. Will the future in China be any different? Let's consider Chinese racism. When you see an African on the street, what honestly is your immediate reaction? Do you think, I don't like black people? Or do you think, those black people might bring in diseases? Those black people smell. Those black people behave badly, I've heard. Or do you think, I don't like poor people, assuming that all Africans are poor? Now, in fact, that's a very much a mistaken assumption. I've done quite a bit of research among the African traders in Guangzhou, and the average trader is much richer than the average Chinese in the city. Your instant reaction can tell you a great deal about how you really think deep inside. Are you a racist? It's a complicated question, but think about it. I've seen much racism in China. This is partly a matter of ignorance. I once saw an old Chinese man walk into an African restaurant in Xiaobei, see an African man, and begin rubbing his skin really hard to see if the color came off. This is real. I saw this. I couldn't believe it, but I've also seen much casual crudity. The term hakwai, shouted by Chinese as Africans pass by. And I've also encountered the very common assumption that Africans come from poor countries. The relation between the color of one's skin and the color of one's passport is really interesting. The latter may be more important than the former in some respects. What if the African you see walking down the street is a citizen of Great Britain, for example? Will this change your view? Country may be more important than skin color in many respects. But discrimination is not simply anti-black, but also anti-foreign, as earlier mentioned, in terms of ethnic nationalism. Chinese parents sometimes say that they wouldn't let their daughter marry an African. And they often would say, I think white people are better than black people. I've heard that. But more, they say they wouldn't allow their daughter to marry any foreigner. How would that foreigner communicate with us? How could they ever understand our lives, they may say. Among the African Chinese couples I know, often the only way to get Chinese parents to accept it is for the daughter to become pregnant. And then the parents have to. But again, what happens to these babies? What kinds of lives will they live in a China that is certainly more open to foreigners than it was 40 and 60 years ago, but that is also growing more and more nationalistic? This leads me back to the basic question with which I began. Will China ever have its own Barack Obama? I asked a Nigerian religious teacher in Guangzhou this question. He told me, my answer is yes, because this is globalization. Africans, Americans, Europeans, Chinese together. This is the new world, a world in which where you come from doesn't matter. Rather, your character, your wisdom is all that matters. I also asked a Chinese Communist Party official the same question. He said, there can only be a Chinese Barack Obama if a top Communist Party official is racially mixed. But no, even then you wouldn't have a Chinese Barack Obama because Chinese people would never support this. China's not racially mixed. For now, China is for Chinese. I've met almost no Africans in Guangzhou who say that the society welcomes them. Eventually, however, China will indeed become a society not just for China, not just for Chinese, but for all the world, simply because it cannot keep the world out. Japan tried for centuries. It's easier in Japan because it's made up of islands, but Japan too has become more open. So will China ever have its own Barack Obama? No, not for the foreseeable future. Given China's current upsurge in nationalism and in holding internationalization at arm's length. But if China's growth continues, if China does not undergo a drop in wealth or another cultural revolution, then this is inevitable. China will become not just for Chinese, but for the world. Now, is this a good thing? I think it's good. I live in Hong Kong. And I feel that Hong Kong, despite my ethnicity, my white skin, is indeed my home. I would love to see this happen in China as well. However, a Chinese person might argue that, hey, China should only be for Chinese. Foreigners, they can be foreign friends, but China should be for Chinese, and that view also is very powerfully held and must be taken seriously. But in any case, whether good or bad, China's internationalization is inevitable if China's affluence continues. China, like the United States and Western Europe, will become a magnet for immigrants from the developing world who seek a better life for themselves. The Africans in Guangzhou are the forerunners of what is to come. This probably won't happen in my lifetime. I'm old, as you can see. But it probably will happen in most of your lifetimes. China will not be the home of Chinese alone, but of people from all over the world. If not you, your children and grandchildren will need to get used to this, for this day is coming. A Chinese Barack Obama will indeed eventually step forth.